Lodge's opposition to Wilson was both principled and personal. From the standpoint of broad principle, Lodge believed that the United States would simply be asking for trouble to guarantee the security of countries all over the world. What's it to us, Lodge said, if one of, well, there's a new country at that point, Czechoslovakia. If Czechoslovakia's neighbors decide to quarrel over the borders of Czechoslovakia, what's it for us? Why should American boys die defending the boundaries that some diplomats drew on the map of Central Europe? What's in it for us? He had his personal reasons for opposing Wilson. He absolutely despised Wilson. He thought that Wilson was out of his depth. He thought that Wilson was entirely on the wrong track. He held Wilson's religious views against him. Now, and this wasn't that hard to do, because Woodrow Wilson was a strict, well, he was a strict Presbyterian and a hardcore predestinarian. In fact, after Wilson was elected in 1912, the chairman of the Democratic National Committee, was responsible essentially for running Wilson's campaign and making sure that all the Democrats were on board, and was as responsible as anybody for lining up all the support that allowed Wilson to win. And the chairman of the committee came into Wilson's office. He was governor of New Jersey at the time. Came into the governor's office, president-elect's office, and said, Governor, Mr. President, there were a lot of people who worked hard on making sure that you became president. And there probably will be some debts to be paid, favors to be given out in exchange for this. And Wilson looked at him and said, God made me president of the United States. I owe nothing to mere humans. Well, you know, with that kind of attitude, that doesn't get you very far in politics. And Lodge had another reason for opposing Wilson. In 1918, as the congressional elections of that year rolled around, Woodrow Wilson took a fateful step, a step that Cleves could have advised him against, that I could have advised him against, that Wilson's advisors in real time advised him, even Wilson's wife advised him against. Wilson determined to make the 1918 congressional elections a referendum on his handling of the war. Oh, this was a risky business. In the first place, he had been president for 6 years. And any historian of the presidency, and for heaven's sakes, Wilson was a historian of the presidency. Any historian of the presidency knows that there is always a 6th year itch. And the incumbent party, the president's party, almost always loses ground in the 6th year of a 2-term administration. And quite obviously, Professor Wilson hadn't listened, well, of course he couldn't have at that point, to Professor Brands, who said that all foreign policy is local. You know why I came up with this about all foreign policy is local? Precisely by studying people like Wilson. Wilson thought that voters would go to the polls in their congressional districts and weigh in on the war. That's not the way American voters work. They weigh in on what's the state of the economy. Have we gotten a new bridge in our district? What has my congressman done for me lately? In the United States, elections almost never turn on foreign policy, and congressional elections really don't turn on foreign policy. Wilson knew all this stuff, but he still felt obliged to make the 1918 congressional elections a referendum on his handling of the war, because he wanted, I should say, that Woodrow Wilson, like a number of other scholars of American politics, had a weak spot for parliamentary government. He thought that the American mixture of Congress and then a president who's elected separately was this odd hybrid that was markedly inferior to the British parliamentary system, where the Prime Minister is the leader of the party in Parliament. And there's a very direct connection between the legislature and the head of government. And furthermore, where votes of confidence or no confidence are the way that the Parliament and then the general elections are the way that the voters themselves register their support or opposition to the party in power. And so Wilson wanted to treat the 1918 congressional elections as a vote of confidence in his administration and his handling of the war. And what he got instead was a resounding vote of no confidence. The Republicans seized both houses in Congress. Wilson had to recognize that this was a slap in the face, and Henry Cabot Lodge greeted the results with glee. Aha! Wilson has had his comeuppance. And, fair enough, Lodge could say that the American people were asked to speak, and they spoke, and they have repudiated President Wilson. Now, I have to say, I wrote an earlier book about Theodore Roosevelt. And Theodore Roosevelt was, for most of his life, a pretty admirable character, and it's one of the reasons he's so admired. But in the aftermath of the 1918 congressional election, Theodore Roosevelt did something that, boy, it would have been hard for any friend of Theodore Roosevelt to accept, even to explain away. Roosevelt had wandered away from the Republican Party in 1912 because the Republicans wouldn't give him the nomination. And so he ran as an independent, as the candidate of the Progressive or Bull Moose Party, and he lost. He split the Republican Party, and he deprived the Republicans of the presidency. If not for Roosevelt's candidacy, the Republicans probably would have remained in power. Roosevelt did find his way back to the Republican fold. And in the autumn of 1918, when these congressional elections are held, Roosevelt was the obvious candidate, the obvious nominee for 1920. It looked as though he would be nominated again. He was the most popular Republican, and he sort of was back in the arms of Republican regularity. And when Wilson, and Theodore Roosevelt despised Wilson almost as much as Henry Cabot Lodge did. And in Roosevelt's case, it was for a slightly different reason. I have a hunch I'm not going to get to my fourth president. Anyway, Roosevelt despised Wilson for a different reason. And it's very interesting watching Roosevelt in his assessment of Wilson. When Roosevelt lost to Wilson in 1912, Theodore Roosevelt was a pretty good loser. He sent a letter congratulating Wilson. And he knew, Roosevelt knew enough about American politics to know that third-party candidates never win. So the fact that he came in second was quite successful for a third-party candidate. And he accepted that the voters had spoken, and he realized that Wilson believed many of the same things that Roosevelt did regarding domestic politics. And until the summer of 1914, Theodore Roosevelt was relatively content in his defeat. Okay, he had made a good race. He couldn't expect to win. He hadn't won. But beginning in the summer of 1914, all of a sudden, Theodore Roosevelt turned very bitter. And it galled him more and more that he had lost the election of 1912. Why? Because Theodore Roosevelt was an adept enough student of American history to know that historical greatness, and by this time, Roosevelt was himself a practicing historian. He knew that the great presidents, the presidents that are considered great in American history, and as of that time, there were two really, really great American presidents, George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. And those two presidents had risen to greatness by their response to challenge, great crisis. George Washington, the crisis of the American Revolutionary War. Abraham Lincoln, the crisis of the Civil War. Theodore Roosevelt knew, as of 1914, that Theodore Roosevelt, would never be considered a great president. And you know why? Not because he didn't consider himself intrinsically great, but because there had been no crisis during his presidency. It is a paradox of American presidential history that the great presidents preside over the worst times. You would not have wanted to live during the presidency of Abraham Lincoln. Probably not during the presidency of George Washington. You know, the third member of this troika of great presidents now is Franklin Roosevelt. And Franklin Roosevelt presided over the Great Depression, the disaster of the American economy during the 20th century, and World War II, which killed off hundreds of thousands of Americans.